We've all seen countless videos of tanks being hit by various anti-tank weapons, but have you ever wondered what actually happens to the crew inside when that happens? That obviously depends on what they're hit with and where, and some tanks give the crew higher chances of surviving than others. But sometimes the results are truly disturbing, especially for recovery teams. We're now going to tell you how this looks with the T-90, Russia's supposed pride tank, through its quite turbulent story. So let's start logically so you'll get the whole picture and not get confused with tanks, called with the letter T and then numbers behind it. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union introduced the T-64 main battle tank, with features considered ahead of its time like the 125mm smoothbore gun, an autoloader, composite armor, and an advanced fire control system. It was quite a shock to the world when it appeared. However, although modern and capable, it was a pain in the arse to produce and sustain due to its complexity and cost. Because of that, only a limited number were reserved for elite units that would be well trained to use such a high-class tank, while regular conscripts got something that would remind you of a World War II T-34. Just instead of 34, it was 72. The T-72 had the same general layout and gun, but it was simplified for easier production, training and use, with more basic and less fancy tech. This way, it was mass-producible and cheaper, intended for regular conscript units and kept in case another major global conflict erupted, where thousands of tanks would need to be produced in a short time. Then we have the T-80, which was an attempt to improve the T-64's fancy concept, but make it actually work. It introduced a gas turbine engine that gave it speed and acceleration, along with upgraded armor and tech. But then, this was not the right fit either, because the turbine burned too much fuel and was again expensive to maintain, yada yada yada. So the T-80 was like the T-64, reserved for high-priority units in smaller numbers. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Army had a bit of a logistical nightmare because it had 3 different tanks, and although they shared the same layout, they all needed unique parts, ammunition, and specifically trained crews, which made it a headache to keep them working together. On top of that came another challenge, as the Cold War showed the importance of modern technology. Exported versions did not help either, as slightly downgraded models of the T-72 were used by other nations and met modern anti-tank weapons. They showed just how vulnerable they were against newer rocket systems, which led to that slight tendency of the T-72 to blow off its turret, something you've all seen. So now, if this made sense to you, the Soviets wanted a single main battle tank that would combine the working elements of the T-64, T-72, and T-80 into one vehicle, with standardized parts, ammunition, and crews. They answered with 2 proposed paths, one being Object 188, a heavily upgraded T-72 with modern systems, reactive armor, and electronic countermeasures, and the other being Object 187. Now, this one would be a completely new design with some radical changes to the hull, turret, engine, and gun. Although promising, it was a risky move in the unstable times of the Soviet Union. Prototypes of this new design arrived in 1990, but within months, the Soviet Union collapsed. The newly formed Russian Federation, left with just 2 operating tank factories, chose the safer and already familiar option. That option was basically injecting the T-72 with steroids. This modernized T-72BM was rebranded as the T-90 to give it a fresh start, although it was basically the same tank with new upgrades. Nevertheless, it was now finally standardized, making logistics a little less of a nightmare. It of course inherited the classical T-72 design. An autoloader, 3-man crew, low profile, covered in Contact 5 explosive reactive armor, and the Stora 1 infrared jamming system. It used laser warning receivers and smoke grenade launchers to counter anti-tank guided missiles. And those were the cool-looking red eyes you can see here, making it look like a Terminator. They also tried to better protect the ammunition, since they were very much aware of what happens with openly stored shells for the main gun upon armor penetration. And you're about to see how successful they were with that in a bit, because they would soon have plenty of chances to test this, unfortunately for their crews. Now, before moving forward, we have to mention the lessons learned when Russian commanders ordered columns of T-72s and T-80 to drive into the city of Grozny during the First Chechen War in 1994. They were welcomed by RPG teams positioned across the ruined city, on multiple floors of buildings in tight streets, where they ambushed and showered the Russian tanks, trapped in kill zones from all directions. Tank losses were horrific, and that famous jack-in-the-box effect was shown on a large scale when the stream of liquid metal from an RPG's shaped charge penetrated thinner side or roof armor, ignited the ammunition and propellant charges stored openly in the autoloader carousel, and sent the turret into space. But how do you think the T-90 would solve, or at least attempt to solve, this? You see, the T-90 wasn't there in the First Chechen War, so it was spared the embarrassment that the T-72 and T-80 suffered. But in 1999, the fighting spread to Dagestan as the Second Chechen War erupted, and Russia diverted some newly built T-90, originally meant for export, to try their chances there. Production moved at a snail's pace as the country was in crisis, and by 1998, only about 150 tanks had entered service. It was rare to see one on the battlefield, but they used this opportunity to test it in combat. After some heavy engagements, there were recorded instances of T-90 receiving 7 direct RPG hits and continuing to fight unfazed, which Russians of course used for propaganda. However, Western analysts claimed that Chechen fighters learned how to defeat Contact 5 explosive reactive armor by repeatedly hitting the same spot with multiple RPG teams ambushing one tank at a time, until the main armor was stripped of ERA blocks and made vulnerable again. So yes, it was tougher to destroy, but far from invincible, especially when sent into cities without proper infantry support, as Russian commanders tended to do for some reason. The T-90 next saw action in Syria in 2015. And there's a widely shown video of a T-90 taking a direct hit from a T-AO missile on its turret and surviving, probably with the explosive reactive armor deflecting the warhead. But still, no one could have imagined what would happen in Ukraine some years later. These mixed results convinced the Russians to upgrade the design further. The T-90 now had a slightly slower but more fuel-efficient diesel engine, pushing about 850 and later 1,000 horsepower. But it still suffered from the same notoriously slow reverse gear of about 2.5 miles per hour. It retained the 125mm smoothbore gun that could fire the same ammunition and even gun-launched missiles. By 2012, Russia halted production of T-90s and tried to focus on a new generation of tanks. But a decade later, only prototypes and scrap designs had been made, so the T-90, unplanned, remained Russia's primary modern tank. In 2020, the newest M model entered service with improved armor, a cage for overhead protection at least in theory, and further improvements to the fire control system, gun stabilization and other features. But then came the Ukraine war, and another embarrassment for Russian tanks. To be fair, it wasn't just Russian tanks. Ukrainian tanks and Western-supplied Abrams and Leopards also didn't shine in their performance. This wasn't due to the tanks themselves, as much as it was due to the evolution of the battlefield and modern weapons. You see, the cat-and-mouse game always evolves. When explosive reactive armor was introduced, tandem charges or top-attacking RPGs were designed to defeat it. Then armor was improved again to counter those. Then came drones. Cages were mounted in response, along with jamming devices, but then came fiber optic drones that could precisely hit the weakest unprotected spot with extreme accuracy. Now World War II era techniques are being revived, with logs, sandbags, metal sheets, cages and other improvised armor piled onto tanks to give some distance between RPGs and the main armor, but still unable to provide real protection. It's a never-ending deadly game, as we can best see in the Ukraine war, where it seems that tanks are obsolete on the modern battlefield. But is this really the case? You'll be the judge of that once you realize what happens to the crew inside. As you may know, the T-90 autoloader, similarly to the T-72 and others, is a rotating carousel under the turret floor where 22 rounds for the main gun are stored. They are stored in 2 pieces, meaning propellant charges and projectiles are separated. Additional rounds, because they couldn't all fit in the autoloader carousel, were stored all around the tank where there was space. In early models, that was about 20 more rounds, and just some of them were actually in designated magazines that were somewhat protected from fire in case of armor penetration. But most of them were stored wherever there was space. So if, or better said when, something hot and sparky goes through the armor, the biggest problem is those propellant charges, because they are much easier to ignite. They, as powder is made to do, create huge overpressure and heat that set off a chain reaction and activate all other ammunition, most of which is high explosive. That results in a huge internal explosion that pops the 12-ton turret high into the sky as if it was nothing. This is the jack-in-the-box effect everyone talks about. And in that case, everything can happen in seconds or less. So there is not much left of the crew to be talked about. Perhaps at least their end was quick and maybe even painless. But this is not always the outcome of a hit on a T-90, and there are many other scenarios that can happen. Now, the T-90 tried to solve, or at least lower, the chance of this effect by storing an additional 8 to 10 rounds in a bustle with blow-off panels so there is ammunition separated from the crew. However, the main carousel with 22 ready rounds still sits just under the crew in the hull. They also added spall liners and extra armor around the carousel. There are also fire suppression systems, but they, at best, buy a couple of seconds for the crew to bail out, if at all. Crews tried to lower the risk by carrying fewer rounds when possible, like going into battle with only 22 rounds in the autoloader and no additional rounds around the tank. But this isn't always possible, and it depends on how far and for how long you need to operate. And 22 rounds is not much for sustained fighting. So all in all, RPGs in all shapes and forms are today's biggest concern and most common danger for any tank, and any RPG that gets through the armor is a big sign that the crew won't have a great day. But what about other weapons they might be hit with? You all saw the video of a Russian T-90 being engaged by a Bradley fighting vehicle in Ukrainian hands. On paper, the Bradley's 25mm chain gun with armor-piercing rounds shouldn't do anything to the thick armor of a main battle tank. But when it actually began hammering the T-90 with repeated hits, it damaged optics and controls. The turret started spinning uncontrollably, the tank crashed and became stuck, and the crew abandoned the vehicle. It was later destroyed with a drone, and 2 crew members were later reported killed if the data is correct. So even in tank-on-tank combat terms, a small 25mm gun can take out a T-90 with a 125mm gun and thick armor if it damages the right external systems and optics. Then we have obviously other tanks that might be fighting the T-90. The most common round used in tank-on-tank engagements is some sort of armor-piercing discarding sabot round, which has great penetration, precision and range. These are so-called kinetic penetrators, basically long spears of very dense metal, usually tungsten or depleted uranium, and their means of destruction is absurd: raw speed and energy. This one is quite interesting. They carry so much energy that when they hit, they vaporize metal and throw a tight cone of superheated fragments and metal particles into the turret in a blink. Sometimes the rod punches clean through and you get 2 neat holes while everything inside is destroyed, especially soft, squishy things like human bodies. Sometimes it breaks up or yaws and makes multiple fragment cones. Sometimes it lodges and then shreds everything on the way. Depleted uranium rods are nasty because they tend to shear and keep a cutting front, and they can create hot pyrophoric dust and fling lethal fragments. Although these rounds don't have any explosive filler and don't explode by themselves, the inside of the tank pretty much looks like something detonated after such rounds go through. When crew survive such hits, even without the armor being penetrated, anti-tank weapons can create violent shock inside the turret that can injure or even kill without the tank looking damaged from the outside. Eardrums, eyes and lungs are all sensitive to that sudden pressure, and fragments can sprawl off the inner armor wall even without penetration, showering the inside with razor-sharp steel. Every hit makes plastics, insulation and fluids burn into a cloud of poisonous smoke. Depleted uranium rods add another layer of fine toxic dust that settles in lungs and eyes, something you don't see but would definitely feel later. So a crew might look fine climbing out, but that doesn't mean they are without injuries. The biggest fear of all tank crews is, of course, fire, and it is perhaps even more feared than explosion. An internal explosion is instant and final, but fire is something you'd always have on your mind as a tanker because you'd be fully aware of what's happening to you in those last moments. Even if you survive being pulled out, the burns and the scars can be worse than death. That's why tankers always feared fire, because it is slow enough to let you understand every second of it, and sometimes living through those seconds is the crueler fate. The T-90 is still out there fighting today as we make this video, and on paper it is still considered a good tank, maybe even the best Russia has. But it never solved the most important problem, the one that decides if the crew walks away or not. Every upgrade gave it better sights, better armor and better engines, but the same old dangers remain inside, so it will likely keep rolling until enough of them are lost or replaced.